In this video, I want to talk about how the West has responded to hybrid attacks from Russia. Right now, there is a news story about Nord Stream that is getting a lot of attention. I don't think this story is credible, and it doesn't change my assessment that most likely Russia was behind the sabotage. I will not go deeper into it here. You can watch my video about Nord Stream if you're interested. But I do want to make a few observations about how the West seems to be reacting to hybrid warfare in general during the war, because I think it's pretty interesting. Hybrid warfare is a part of this conflict. I have seen some online discussions where people argue whether Russia might be willing to take this step and sort of launch a major hybrid campaign against the West at some point. Well, the answer is obviously yes. Of course they will. There is a war going on. Everything is on the table. Russia will definitely get to hybrid warfare long before they get to nuclear warfare, for example, which is also one of the options that people sometimes discuss. And in fact, I think we should probably expect that Russia's hybrid warfare is already happening. The interesting thing from a military perspective, I think, is more the Western response. Like the typical reaction to hybrid warfare is to expose the attack so that you can get it out into the open and then you can respond. And this is also what I've explained in other videos. I typically use a David Kilcullen's model about liminal warfare to make this point that that what you really want to do is you want to push hybrid activity up above the detection threshold, and that way you create options for the politicians to respond. But I think we have a pretty interesting and quite different dynamic going on right now, because I think the situation is that Western politicians are actually pretty confident about how the war in Ukraine is going. The Western strategy has all the time been based on two priorities. Priority number one is that the war should be isolated to Ukraine and not spread to other countries. And then priority number two is to help Ukraine win the war. And the order of those priorities is important. But the impression in the West is that things are actually going really well with both of those priorities, that they have a winning strategy. And right now, if they just stick to that strategy, then over time, Russia will lose. And it is also the assessment that that Russia doesn't actually have the resources to substantially hurt the Western societies directly. So the risk from hybrid warfare is pretty low, or it can be managed. So the understanding is that Russian hybrid warfare against the West has the purpose of trying to disrupt that winning strategy, to create fear and uncertainty in the Western societies, and to force Western politicians to sort of divert resources from helping Ukraine and into national security instead. So the point I want to get to is that in the current situation, it would actually be counterproductive for Western politicians to respond to hybrid attacks, because pretty much nothing good could come out of it. Like if they make a big deal out of some hybrid attack, then they are actually going to do that would actually be doing a favor to the attacker, because it is exactly the kind of attention that the attacker wants. So my interpretation of what we're seeing is that instead of trying to respond to hybrid attacks, then Western politicians are basically doing everything they can to ignore them. Like in Kilcullen's terms, instead of sort of pushing the attack up above the response threshold, then they would rather try to push it all the way to the bottom, down below the detection threshold, because that way we can all just forget about it and continue winning the war. So I think that is why when we look at the things that are happening, it pretty much looks like Western countries are very quick to sort of put a lid on anything that looks like a hybrid attack. And there's actually been quite a few things like sabotage of train traffic, cyber attacks, GPS jamming, electricity cables that are cut, Nord Stream, of course, and maybe also those missiles in Poland. And every time, then all these things have very quickly been shut down. Like either they are quickly dismissed as this is definitely not hybrid warfare, or else they've been buried in some very, very thorough, endless investigations that maybe sometime in a distant future will lead to something, because that way we don't have to respond now. And I think I think this is pretty smart, because it means that the hybrid attacks become much less interesting for Russia. Like essentially, the message to Russia is that if you want our attention, then you have to attack NATO in such a way that it is absolutely totally obvious that the West is not going to give Russia the privilege of deniability, and that if they keep on doing annoying stuff where they will have deniability, then we're just going to ignore that and keep focusing on defeating Russia in the war. So my expectation is that almost no matter what happens in the hybrid space, then the West is not going to respond. And that is also why I don't think there will come anything particularly interesting out of the Nord Stream investigations, at least not until the war in Ukraine is over. Because even if there is a clear-cut evidence that Russia is behind this, then the Western politicians just don't want to have to respond to it, because it would be counterproductive. And of course, that leaves a huge space for conspiracy theories about who did it. But that's fine. Like, in fact, it's great, because it means that Russia's hybrid warfare is not working. If it were working, then we would be talking about it, and we would be afraid of what Russia might do next. So my guess is actually that in Moscow, they are quite annoyed that these conspiracy theories get so much traction. Like, they would much prefer to get some of the blame themselves. But of course, they can't say that, because that would destroy their deniability. So they're just sort of playing along as best as they can. Okay, if you found this video useful, please give it a like, and also remember to subscribe to the channel so you get notifications when I upload a new video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.